The battlefield had already swallowed 3 sniper teams before dawn. Every soldier who crossed the ridge died within seconds, no warning, no mercy, just a single shot between the eyes. The men whispered the enemy had deployed invisible marksmen. Others said the mountain itself was cursed. But Captain Elias knew something worse was happening, because the shots followed the exact same pattern as a sniper who had died 6 years ago, a woman they once called the White Ghost. And when the radio suddenly crackled with her voice in the middle of the night, every veteran on the battlefield froze in terror. The mountain had no name on any current map. It existed only in old military records, labeled with a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't bled on its slopes. The fog came before sunrise each morning, thick and unmoving, settling into the ravines like something alive and deliberate. Visibility dropped to 30 meters on a clear morning. On a bad one, less than that, close enough to see the bark texture of a tree trunk and nothing beyond it. The pine trees stood so dense along the upper ridge that even thermal equipment struggled to penetrate the canopy, and the rocks along the eastern face formed a natural series of overhangs that a trained marksman could exploit for days without changing position. There was water under the rocks. There was shelter, if you knew where to look. There were angles that defied what most snipers believed was geometrically achievable, angles that required not just technical knowledge but a certain willingness to think beyond the boundary of what the training manual considered possible. It was the kind of terrain that separated soldiers who had studied war from soldiers who had lived it, and it was the kind of terrain that, in the right hands, became something closer to a weapon than a landscape. Captain Elias Harrow had lived it for 16 years. He stood at the edge of the forward operating base that first morning, watching the mist shift above the tree line, and he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt since the early days of his career, not quite fear, but the close cousin of it, the awareness that something on that mountain was smarter than the men he commanded. The previous evening, 2 4-man reconnaissance teams had been sent up the eastern approach. By midnight, all 8 were dead. Not wounded, not captured, dead. Each man struck by a single round. Each shot placed with a precision that the forensics team described in flat, clinical language that somehow made it worse. No wasted ammunition. No hesitation. The geometry of each kill was almost architectural. Sergeant Marcus Webb found him at the observation post just after 0400, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had stopped sleeping. He handed 1 cup to Elias without speaking, and they stood together in the dark, staring at the ridge. Webb was the oldest soldier in the unit, 41 years old with a knee held together by 2 screws and stubbornness, and he had served under Elias for 9 of those years. He knew when his captain needed silence and when he needed information. This morning, he delivered both. The shots, Webb said quietly, are coming from above the 300-meter mark, we think, but every position we've identified gets abandoned before our teams can reach it. The enemy moves like they know exactly when we're coming. Elias nodded slowly. He had already suspected that. What troubled him more deeply was something else entirely: the angles. He had spent the previous 3 hours reviewing the trajectory analysis of every confirmed kill, plotting the geometry on a physical map with a pencil the old way, the way his first instructor had taught him, because sometimes numbers on a screen lied and pencil lines told the truth. The truth those lines told him was disturbing. The shots had originated from positions that required not just skill but a very specific kind of imagination. The ability to visualize a bullet's path through 3-dimensional space, accounting for wind layering at different elevations, temperature differentials between valley floor and ridge crest, the way certain rock formations created microclimates that altered trajectory in ways no standard calculator would predict. He knew only one person who had ever operated that way, and she was dead. The official record said so, filed 6 years ago with a date and a reference number and no body to accompany it. Amelia Voss. The file called her specialist, then later sergeant, then carried no rank at all for the final 18 months of her service because the program she had been assigned to officially did not exist. Elias had served alongside her for 3 years before that disappearance, and he had never once seen her miss. Not in training, not in the field, not under any condition that human beings were designed to withstand. She had made shots that other trained marksmen refused to confirm, because confirming them meant acknowledging something that defied what they believed was physically possible. The men called her the White Ghost, though not to her face. She didn't particularly care for theatrics, and she had a manner of looking at a person that made exaggeration feel embarrassing. The name came from her habit of wearing a pale canvas wrap over her gear in winter conditions, something she had modified herself from a standard issue tarp, cut and weighted in ways she never fully explained. In snow, she became the landscape. You could be looking directly at her position and see nothing but white and shadow. There were stories, and Elias believed most of them, of enemy scouts walking within 4 meters of her without detecting her presence. She would simply wait. She had infinite patience. He had once watched her hold a position for 11 hours without moving, without eating, barely breathing, until the window opened and she took her shot and vanished before the echo finished rolling down the mountainside. And then came the mission that took her away. A deep penetration operation into territory that command had flagged as high risk, under-resourced, and strategically marginal. Elias had argued against it. He had put his objection in writing, which in the military was a significant act, and it had been noted and ignored. Amelia's team of 4 went in on a Thursday and were never heard from again. The search lasted 72 hours before command declared the area untenable and stood down the recovery effort. Elias had gone to his commanding officer and been told, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that the matter was closed. 3 days later, the paperwork designated Amelia Voss as killed in action. No remains recovered. Mission classified. Elias had signed nothing. He had never believed she was dead. Private Dalton Reyes was 22 years old and had been in active service for 14 months. He was not a superstitious person by nature. He had grown up in a practical household where things were explained in clear terms, and mystery was something that happened in other people's lives. But he had been awake for 31 hours by the time his radio crackled, and in the particular exhaustion that follows prolonged danger, the mind becomes permeable in ways it normally isn't. The voice came through clearly, amid the static, unmistakably female, low and completely controlled. "Don't move. They're watching you." He turned to look at the soldier crouched 2 meters to his left, and the man's face had gone the color of old ash. Neither of them moved for a very long time, and when the ridge position that Reyes had been about to advance toward was struck by artillery minutes later, a position that should have been safe, he understood that whatever the voice was, it had just saved his life. He reported it to Elias at first light, his hands still unsteady. And Elias listened without expression, asked 2 questions, and walked back to his tent alone. He sat on the edge of his cot for a long time. Outside, the fog was lifting off the mountain. He stared at the canvas wall and thought about a woman who shot like architecture, who wore white in the snow, who had never trusted the army that employed her, and he thought, she is up there. Before she became a ghost story, Amelia Voss had been something rarer, a person who was genuinely, almost incomprehensibly good at a specific thing, in a way that other people who were good at that thing could not fully account for. She had grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a hunting guide and a schoolteacher, in a place where the distance between towns was measured in hours, and the wind was a constant presence that a person either learned to read or spent their entire life fighting. She had learned to read it. She had learned to read everything: animal sign in mud, the behavior of light through cloud cover, the way sound traveled differently depending on the moisture content of the air. By the time she enlisted at 19, she already possessed the foundational skills of a sniper that most trainees spent years attempting to approximate. The military had not known entirely what to do with her. She excelled in every measured category, but she was quiet in ways that made some evaluators uncomfortable, and she had a habit of questioning operational decisions that was technically within regulations but culturally unwelcome. She did not question them loudly. She was not a person who raised her voice. She simply asked clear, specific questions that had the effect of making inadequate planning visible to everyone in the room, which was considered, in certain command cultures, worse than insubordination. She asked things like, who verified the intelligence, and when, and through which channel? She asked, what is the extraction contingency if the primary route is compromised? She asked, has anyone in this room personally assessed the terrain, or are we working from imagery? These were not unreasonable questions. They were, in fact, exactly the right questions, but they required answers that planning officers didn't always have, and the absence of answers was embarrassing. And embarrassment in institutional settings tends to be managed by targeting the person who caused it rather than the deficiency that person revealed. Elias had recognized her quality the first week they worked together. He had also recognized that the institution surrounding her would eventually fail to protect someone it didn't fully understand. Their partnership had been professional at its foundation and something more complicated around the edges, the kind of closeness that forms between people who operate under sustained pressure and mutual dependence, where trust becomes physical. He had known she was careful with herself in ways that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with a deep, almost philosophical skepticism about permanence. She did not believe that anything good lasted. He had never found the right circumstances to tell her that he disagreed. And then the circumstances ran out. She had been 27 when she disappeared. He was 31. He had thought about her with varying frequency for 6 years, and when he was honest with himself, which he tried to be, since dishonesty in a commander had downstream consequences, he understood that he had never stopped thinking about her entirely. She occupied a specific gravity in his mind, unchanged since the day the report came in. He had filed a copy of that report in a folder he kept separate from everything else, and he had never opened it again, because opening it would have meant accepting what it said. The rifle that shot Private Chen, that shot Private Morgan. He corrected himself. The name having slipped in the exhaustion bore a marking on the recovered round that no standard enemy weapon produced. It was a small imperfection on the base of the casing, a tool mark from a custom reloading die, and Elias recognized it the moment the ordnance technician showed it to him under a field loop. He had seen that mark before. On a range in Colorado, 6 years ago, in a case of hand-loaded ammunition that Amelia had prepared herself, because she believed commercial loads introduced variability that she was not willing to accept. He stared at the mark for a long time. The technician asked if he recognized it. Elias said no and handed the casing back. Elias deployed everything he had available against the ridge over the next 72 hours, and it made no difference. 3 surveillance drones flew patterns over the upper mountain and returned imagery showing nothing or almost nothing, which was worse, because it meant whoever was up there understood drone flight patterns well enough to avoid them rather than simply hide from them. The thermal imaging team spent a full night scanning the eastern face and detected a heat signature once, briefly, at approximately 0230, a shape consistent with a prone human form at an elevation that should have been inaccessible without mountaineering equipment. By the time the imaging was relayed and a team was vectored toward the position, it was gone. Not withdrawn, gone, as if it had never existed. The counter-sniper team, 6 of the most experienced marksmen in the brigade, set up overlapping observation posts covering every viable line of approach to the ridge. Within 18 hours, 2 of them had been shot. The 4 survivors requested extraction. The mood in the forward operating base deteriorated in the way that moods deteriorate when soldiers cannot identify their enemy and cannot protect their own. Rumors are the natural currency of fear, and they circulated freely. The ghost of the mountain, the spirit of the dead, an enemy super soldier trained by methods outside the scope of normal military science. Some of the older soldiers, the ones who had served in mountain theaters before, grew quiet in a particular way that was more unnerving than the rumors. They had seen enough to know that some things resisted rational explanation, even when a rational explanation existed, and they had learned to be afraid of those things accordingly. 3 soldiers left their positions one night without orders. They were retrieved and disciplined, but Elias did not pursue the matter aggressively, because he understood that the line between discipline and cruelty was context-dependent, and these were men who had held their positions longer than they should have been asked to. The counter-sniper who was shot inside the bunker was named Senior Sergeant Raymond Kelso, a 15-year veteran with an exceptional record who had survived 3 previous combat deployments and 3 separate occasions in which his death had appeared statistically certain. He was shot through a ventilation aperture in a reinforced bunker that he had personally inspected and declared secure. The aperture was 11 centimeters wide and located on the north face, which was considered unexploitable from any known position on the mountain. The trajectory analysis suggested the round had traveled approximately 1.3 kilometers and passed through the aperture with a margin of less than 4 centimeters on either side. Elias sat with this information for a long time. Then he pulled out the old map, not the digital version, the actual paper one with the hand-drawn notations from years ago, and he found the position from which that shot was geometrically possible. There was only one, and it was a position that Amelia had identified to him, in a conversation he had almost forgotten, during a training exercise in similar terrain 8 years ago. She had pointed to a spot on a ridge and said, offhandedly, that if you ever needed to close a ventilation aperture from altitude, that was where you'd set up. He had nodded and moved on and filed the information in the part of his mind reserved for things that were interesting but not immediately useful. The thermal imaging recorded the shape at 0217, a female silhouette, standing fully upright on an exposed ridgeline in a way that made no tactical sense, standing there deliberately, visible for exactly 4 seconds, and then simply not there. No movement captured, no thermal trail leading away from the position. Just presence and then absence, as if the mountain had briefly chosen to show him something and then changed its mind. He went looking in the archives 3 days later, working through channels he hadn't used since leaving a certain classified division, calling in favors from people who owed him in currency that didn't appear on any official ledger. What he found required several hours to process, and he processed it alone, in the small hours of the morning, with the camp quiet around him and his coffee long cold on the table and the lantern turned down low because he had developed, over years, the habit of thinking in near darkness when the thinking was difficult. What he found required him to revise everything he had believed about the mission, about the institution, and about himself. The mission that had taken Amelia's team had not been what the briefing documents said it was. The stated objective reconnaissance of a suspected supply route was real but minor. A cover for the actual purpose, which was the extraction of intelligence pertaining to a weapons transaction between a defense contractor with ties to senior military leadership and a state-affiliated arms dealer operating under diplomatic cover. Amelia's team had been inserted not to gather this intelligence, but to destroy it, not the transaction itself, the evidence. And Amelia, who asked clear questions in rooms full of people who didn't want clear questions asked, had apparently asked enough of them in the preceding weeks to have been identified as a liability before the mission orders were even finalized. Her name had appeared in internal communications as a risk factor, not an enemy. A risk factor. That was the language used, the language of administrators managing a problem rather than soldiers making a decision about a comrade. The mission had not been mismanaged. It had been deliberately compromised. The insertion coordinates had been fed to the opposing force 48 hours before the team went in. 4 people were sent into an ambush that command had arranged because 4 people had become inconvenient to a financial arrangement that involved several $100 million and at least 2 generals whose names appeared in subsequent commendation lists as examples of distinguished service. He read through the documents with the careful, methodical attention that years of intelligence work had trained into him, and he felt something cold moving through his chest that wasn't quite emotion and wasn't quite the absence of it. He had not saved her. He had been told not to look, and he had obeyed, because he had genuinely believed that the institution's decision to stand down the recovery effort represented an institutional judgment made in good faith about operational realities. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the way that trust makes a person wrong not carelessly, not stupidly, but in the way that believing something about a system makes a person unable to correctly perceive evidence that the system is not what they believe it to be. He sat with this understanding for a long time. He did not allow himself the exit of saying that he could not have known, because knowing was precisely what he had been trained for, and there had been signs that he had chosen not to read. He was still sitting with this understanding when the coordinates arrived on a secure channel he had not given anyone outside his immediate unit. A set of map coordinates and nothing else, except a single line below them, Come Alone. The abandoned research station had been built in the late 1980s by a geological survey organization that no longer existed, and it sat at 2,300 meters elevation in a bowl of rock sheltered on 3 sides by ridge walls that made it invisible from below and from satellite imagery taken at standard angles. Elias reached it in 4 hours through a storm that began as light snow and became, somewhere above the 1,500-meter mark, a white wall of wind and ice that reduced visibility to the reach of his outstretched arm. He wore no rank insignia. He carried a sidearm and left everything else behind, as the coordinates seemed to implicitly require. The station door was unlocked. The interior was cold, but not as cold as outside, and there was a lantern burning on a table that had been cleared of the debris of decades of abandonment. She was standing at the far wall with her back to him when he entered. He recognized the posture before he recognized anything else about her. The particular stillness, the quality of attention directed outward rather than inward, the sense of a person whose awareness extended past the room she occupied. She did not turn around immediately. When she turned, he saw a face that was the same and completely different. The geometry was unchanged. She had the same sharp jaw, the same dark eyes that processed information faster than she let on, the same quality of containment, everything held inside and nothing given away without deliberate choice. But the 6 years had altered the expression in ways that weren't about aging. Something in the specific set of her mouth, something about the way her eyes met his and then moved past him, checking the door, the window, the angles, before returning, assessing threat before allowing recognition. She had always been careful. She was now something beyond careful. She was a person who had been hunted for 6 years and had survived it by becoming more dangerous than the people hunting her. The shoulder where she'd been grazed at some earlier point bore a scar he could see above the collar of her jacket, pale and slightly raised, a record of something she had survived without assistance. There were other marks he couldn't see. He knew enough about what 6 years of operating alone in hostile terrain did to a person's body and to the parts of a person that didn't show on the outside to understand that what he was looking at was someone who had rebuilt themselves from a very damaged foundation into something functional and formidable and deeply, privately exhausted. He said her name. She said his. There was a silence that contained a great deal. She crossed the room and sat down across from him at the table and folded her hands in front of her with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision about how this conversation will go and intends to hold to it. She told him what the mountain was, not a defensive position, not an enemy stronghold, a trap. Every death on the ridge over the past 2 weeks had been calculated to pull a specific type of command structure to a specific location. A command structure that included people whose names appeared in documents she had spent 6 years assembling. The battlefield was a mechanism. She had built it. The enemy marksmen that command was desperately trying to identify were, in large part, her. She had moved through their positions, used their terrain, exploited gaps in their defenses that she had identified before anyone on either side had arrived. She had been here before this operation began. She had been planning this for a long time. Elias listened without speaking until she finished. Then he asked a single question. How many people have you killed who shouldn't have died? She looked at him steadily. None, she said. Every shot on that mountain had been placed to disable, to redirect, to create fear without taking a life that didn't warrant taking. The soldiers who died on the ridge had been killed by the opposing force. She had simply manipulated the terrain and the intelligence flow to ensure that the opposing force and the target command structure remained in proximity long enough for the trap to close. He asked her what the trap was. She told him. Then she said, "Tonight, the generals die." And for the first time, the containment in her face cracked slightly, and he saw beneath it something that was not coldness, but its opposite, a grief so old and so compressed that it had become structural, weight-bearing, the thing she was built around now rather than carrying. She looked at him across the table and said, very quietly, "You didn't come back for me." It was not an accusation, precisely. It was a statement of fact delivered in a tone that understood he might have had reasons and didn't particularly care what they were. He had not come back. 6 years of silence had communicated everything that the absence of action communicates. What Amelia had built over those 6 years was not a life, exactly, but a sustained purpose. She had survived the initial ambush through a combination of preparation and the particular kind of luck that attaches itself to people who have made thorough preparation. Their permanent condition. She had anticipated betrayal in the abstract even before she had evidence of it specifically, because she was the kind of person who thought clearly about the system she operated within, and the system had given her reasons for abstract concern. She had gone into the mission with a contingency that her teammates hadn't known about, because sharing contingencies with people who might be observed increased the risk that the contingency would be anticipated. She had survived and they had not, and that fact lived with her in the way that survivor facts always live, not as guilt. Exactly, because guilt implies a choice that she had not had, but as weight. Permanent, structural weight. The kind that changes the posture over time, that makes itself known in small ways to anyone who knows what to look for. She had made her way out of the ambush zone alone, injured, carrying nothing but a sidearm and the accumulated knowledge of 16 years of learning how terrain and weather and human behavior interacted. She had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for 48 hours before she allowed herself to stop, and when she stopped, she was at the edge of a forest above a small farming community, watching the lights in the windows below, calculating risk and necessity and deciding in favor of necessity, because the injury to her side was not going to heal on its own in the cold. She had been taken in by a village at lower elevation, a small community of farmers and foresters who asked few questions and received careful generosity in return. The family whose home she was brought to the man was named something she was never entirely sure she'd heard correctly, and his wife was a small, efficient woman who inspected the wound with the pragmatic authority of someone who had dealt with injury before and did not require drama to manage it. They did not ask her who she was or what had happened. They bandaged the wound, fed her, gave her a place to sleep that was warm and private, and in the morning the wife set a bowl of soup on the table and left her alone with it. She ate slowly and looked at the steam rising from the bowl and made certain decisions about what her life was going to be. She spent 8 months there recovering and thinking, and the thinking was the harder work. She thought about the men she had served with and the institution she had served within and the nature of systems that could decide, in the service of financial arrangements, to expend human beings like ammunition. She thought about what she owed to the dead and what she owed to herself and whether those two things pointed in the same direction. She concluded, eventually, that they did. Then she had started working. The work was patient. She had no institutional resources, no government support, no network beyond the people she had personally built trust with over time. What she had was time and the kind of intelligence that doesn't come from databases, the human kind. The kind that accumulates through sustained presence in a place, through being reliable and quiet and useful, through never asking for more than was offered and always giving more than was asked. She had mapped the financial flows. She had identified the principles. She had found the evidence, not all of it, but enough, and stored it in places and forms that could survive her death if it came to that. And then she had started arranging the conditions for what she called, in her own private accounting, a reckoning. She had not planned on Elias being here. His presence was a complication she had not built into the model, because his presence made certain things harder to remain certain about. The first assassination attempt came at 2200 on a staff officer whose convoy took a mountain road that thermal mapping had identified as compromised. The convoy stopped, the officer was extracted by helicopter, and the road exploded 3 minutes later. Shaped charge, placed professionally. The radio network used by the higher echelon command structure went dark at 2217 when a relay installation at altitude suffered catastrophic failure that the technical analysts later described as consistent with deliberate sabotage executed with extraordinary access and timing. General Prentice, one of the 3 principals whose names appeared most frequently in Amelia's assembled documents, was in a command vehicle that was struck by a round through the armored windshield at 2241. He survived. The round had been placed to demonstrate penetrability rather than to kill, which was either extraordinary marksmanship or a message, and the analysis teams couldn't agree on which. What they agreed on was that the shooter had been at an elevation that the vehicle's armored plating had been rated to withstand, which meant either the rating was wrong or the ammunition was not standard. It was not standard. Elias moved through the mountain that night, trying to intercept her, using the terrain knowledge he had accumulated over 2 weeks of studying the ridge and the additional knowledge that 6 years of thinking about how she thought had given him. He found her twice. The first time, she was already gone by the time he reached the position, a depression in the snow where she had lain, the faint impression of a bipod, the absence of a shell casing because she never left casings behind. The second time, he arrived at the same moment she did, and they looked at each other across 20 meters of snow-covered rock in the light of a parachute flare that someone had launched from the valley below. She held a rifle. He held his hands open. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He said her name once. She said nothing, then she moved, and it was extraordinary to watch, not because it was fast, but because it was absolutely correct, each footfall placed with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped thinking about movement and simply moved, the way a musician stops thinking about technique and simply plays. He did not attempt to follow her. He understood that following her was not something he was capable of on this terrain in this darkness, and attempting it would only communicate that he didn't understand what she was. The exchange of fire that followed between Amelia and the counter-sniper team that had tracked her thermal signature to a saddle below the main ridge was, by the account of the 2 surviving members of that team, unlike anything they had encountered in training or in the field. She was not in the position they had targeted. She was somewhere else, and by the time they understood this, 2 of their 6 members were downstruck in non-lethal locations, with a precision that suggested the lethality was a choice rather than a limitation. The rounds had passed through muscle and clear of bone with margins that the medical team later described as anatomically deliberate. The remaining 4 attempted to reposition and were pinned by a sustained pattern of fire from a single shooter that made repositioning geometrically impossible. The flares went up and the mountain lit white and red and the trees threw long shadows across the snow, and somewhere in all of that light and shadow she moved and they could not find her. They held their positions until Elias arrived and ordered them to stand down, which they did with visible relief. Amelia was struck by a round from the last active countersniper sometime around 0100. The round hit her left shoulder, and she did not stop moving. The thermal signature tracked her movement for approximately 400 meters before disappearing into a terrain feature that the imagery analysts could not resolve. She was gone. The blood trail in the snow lasted 3 meters and then stopped, as if she had sealed herself against the cold and continued regardless, which was, Ilyas thought, exactly what she would have done. He stood at the point where the trail ended and looked up the mountain and listened to the wind and heard nothing. The documents came in the following days, delivered through channels so indirect and so carefully constructed that the military's counterintelligence apparatus spent 3 weeks trying to trace their origin, and eventually concluded that whoever had compiled them had been extremely thorough and almost certainly very patient. The documents were authenticated. General Ward, whose name had appeared in Amelia's private accounting more frequently than any other, who was 3 weeks from receiving a national commendation for distinguished service in the very theater where the weapons transaction had been executed, was placed under investigation. The same morning, his commendation ceremony was scheduled to begin. The investigation moved faster than most, partly because the documents were comprehensive, and partly because, when investigators began pulling threads, the threads led immediately to other threads, and within 72 hours, the structure of the arrangement was visible in its entirety. Ward had met Amelia once, years before, in a briefing room where she had asked one of her careful questions and he had answered it with the smooth confidence of a man who had learned to perform authority convincingly. He had looked at her the way certain powerful people look at obstacles they haven't yet decided to remove. She had looked back. She had not forgotten. The last 20 minutes before Ward was taken into custody unfolded in a way that the official record captured only partially. He was in a forward command post when 2 military investigators arrived. He met them in a small anteroom, and for approximately 12 minutes, he attempted to negotiate, not in the obvious sense of offering information in exchange for terms, but in the subtler sense of framing the situation in language that positioned his choices as strategically necessary rather than personally corrupt. He spoke about difficult decisions made in complex environments. He spoke about the cost of maintaining operational capabilities in a world that required uncomfortable compromises. He spoke about the soldiers whose careers he had advanced and the operations he had enabled and the outcomes that could not have been achieved without the kind of flexibility he had exercised. He spoke fluently and at length, and the investigators listened, and at the end of 12 minutes, they arrested him. His commendations were stripped. His pension was revoked. His name was removed from the building at Fort Carson that had been named after him, though the building stood for another year before anyone got around to updating the sign, which was the kind of institutional detail that made Elias's jaw tighten whenever he thought about it. 2 of the 3 senior officers whose names appeared in Amelia's documents were taken into military custody within the week. The 3rd had retired to a private residence in the Southwest and was apprehended by federal agents on a Tuesday morning while tending his garden. He did not resist. He appeared to have expected it for some time. Elias spent the months that followed the operation looking for Amelia. He did this methodically and without institutional support, using the same patient intelligence-gathering approach that he had spent a career developing, applying it now to a purpose entirely personal and with an urgency that he managed carefully, because urgency in intelligence work produces errors, and he could not afford errors. He found traces. A contact in the village at lower elevation who described a woman matching her description who had stayed there briefly the previous winter and left without notice, as she always had. The contact said she had repaired the roof of an elderly couple's house while she was there, working through 2 days of rain without being asked. She had refused payment. She had eaten very little. She had asked about the road conditions to the north and departed in the early morning before anyone was awake, leaving behind a folded piece of canvas on the table that the elderly couple kept because it seemed important, though they couldn't have said exactly why. A report from a border region of a sniper who had intervened in an ambush of a humanitarian convoy and disappeared into high ground before anyone could identify her. A shell casing found at an elevation where no military unit had been operating, bearing the tool mark of a custom reloading die that produced a very specific imperfection on the base of each round. He collected these traces and plotted them on a map and looked at the pattern they made, and the pattern told him what he already suspected: she was still out there, still moving, still choosing her moments, still unwilling or unable to come back to a world that had attempted to erase her. He thought about that word, unwilling. He thought about whether it was accurate, or whether it was a word that let him avoid the harder word, which was unable to trust that the world she came back to would not simply attempt the same thing again. With better planning and fewer witnesses, he could not blame her for that calculation. He had read the documents. He knew what had been done and by whom and for what reason, and he knew that the institutional appetite for protecting institutional interests did not simply end because specific individuals had been identified and held to account. The formal declaration came 6 weeks after Ward's arrest. General Thomas Ward, formerly of the Joint Operations Command and recipient of 11 commendations including the Distinguished Service Medal, was designated an enemy of the armed forces of the United States. His commendations were stripped. His pension was revoked. His name was removed from the building at Fort Carson that had been named after him, though the building stood for another year before anyone got around to updating the sign, which was the kind of institutional detail that made Elias's jaw tighten whenever he thought about it. The soldiers who had died on the mountain, including the 8 men from the first reconnaissance teams, were reclassified in records that would never be made entirely public, because the full truth of what they had been sent toward required acknowledging things that the institution was not yet prepared to acknowledge fully. Elias wrote individual letters to the families. He wrote them by hand, which took 3 weeks, and said in each letter what he could say honestly, which was not everything but was more than official policy permitted, and he sealed them and sent them. He did not know if any of the families found them adequate. He suspected they did not. 6 months later, a border conflict erupted in a mountain region that shared certain topographical characteristics with the ridge, the same density of pine forest, the same layered fog in the morning hours, the same quality of silence that preceded violence in high terrain. The soldiers sent there were young, as soldiers in such places often are, because youth and distance from home are both cheaper than wisdom. A young corporal named Davis Whitmore had separated from his unit during a disorganized withdrawal and found himself alone on an exposed slope with an enemy sniper tracking him from a position he couldn't identify. He was 20 years old and had been in service for 11 months, and he was not, at that moment, thinking about anything except the rock in front of him and the cold and the fact that the shot he was waiting for had not come yet, which was information but not comfortable information because it only meant the shooter was being patient. He lay behind a rock that was providing approximately 60% of the cover he needed and waited in the way that soldiers wait when they have run out of options, not peacefully, but with the particular stillness that the body imposes when the mind has accepted that it cannot solve the problem by moving. The shot came. Not at him. He heard the crack of a high-velocity round and felt the concussive signature of it in the air above him and waited for the impact, and it didn't arrive, and after a long moment he looked up and the slope above him was quiet in a way that it had not been 2 seconds earlier, a different quality of quiet, the quiet of a threat that had been removed rather than a threat that was simply waiting. He scanned the surrounding high ground with eyes that the adrenaline had sharpened past their normal range, looking for movement, for shape, for the color of a muzzle against rock or snow, and he found nothing, almost nothing. At the edge of his vision, at the limit of what his unaided eyes could resolve against the whiteness of the ridge, perhaps 600 meters distant, a figure in a pale wrap stood for a moment with the absolute stillness of someone who has already decided whether they want to be seen and has decided, this once, that the answer is yes. And then the figure turned and walked, and was gone into the mist with the unhurried certainty of someone moving through terrain they know completely, and the mountain was white and empty, and the wind moved through the pines below. He reported the incident when he rejoined his unit. His sergeant listened and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. Someone later, weeks later, in a different country, in a conversation over coffee that neither participant had planned, told him what everyone in the particular community of people who operated in mountain terrain had already come to accept, that there was a presence on certain ridgelines that could not be accounted for by any deployed force on either side, and that this presence had a pattern of intervening at the precise moment when a soldier who could not save himself was about to die. Some people called it coincidence. Some people called it something else. Some people didn't talk about it at all, because talking about it required explaining things that led to answers that made certain people in certain rooms very uncomfortable. And some people, the oldest ones, the ones who had operated in high terrain long enough to understand that the mountain kept its own records, simply called it what it was. In a command post somewhere above the tree line, Elias Harrow stood at an observation window and looked at the mountain. The map on the table behind him was covered in notations, and one of those notations was a position at altitude that he had marked in red pencil and had not shared with anyone. He had been marking that position every morning for 2 weeks now, adjusting it slightly based on what the previous day's information suggested, building a model of where she was by the same process he had always used to understand her, not by tracking her, but by thinking like her, reasoning from terrain and objective, and the logic of a mind that never wasted a position or a movement or a moment of visibility. He did not know if she could see the command post from wherever she was. He thought it was possible. He thought that if she could, she had probably been watching him stand at this window on other mornings too, and had made her own calculations about what that meant. He looked at the mountain for a long time. Then he went to his radio, opened a channel that was not on the official network, a frequency that no one had assigned him and that he had no official reason to know, and he said 2 words into it. Nothing came back. He had not expected anything to come back. He put the radio down and returned to the window and stood there in the cold room while the morning fog moved along the ridge, and he thought about patience, about time, about the difference between a person who was gone and a person who had chosen to become a ghost. He thought about what it would take for a person who had chosen to become a ghost to choose otherwise, what it would require from the world, and from him specifically, and whether he had anything left to offer that was worth offering. He thought about the village woman who had kept a folded piece of canvas because it seemed important. He thought about a shell casing on an uninhabited slope. He thought about a woman who stood on a ridgeline for 4 seconds in full view because she had chosen to, which meant she had decided in that moment, for whatever reason, that being seen was worth the risk. He held that thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile, and he didn't press it, because pressing it would require certainty he didn't have. He thought about a woman who had once told him, in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than melancholy, that the most accurate shot you could make was one that no one ever had to know you made. He thought about a mark on a shell casing. He thought about 4 seconds on a ridgeline, and then nothing. Outside, the fog was doing what it always did in the early morning, moving without apparent direction, as if exploring the mountain rather than crossing it, pooling in the low places, thinning along the high edges, making the tree line intermittently visible and then obscured again. He stood at the window until the light changed and the mountain became itself again, ordinary and cold and full of shadows. And he said nothing, and he waited, because waiting was the thing she had taught him best. He waited for a long time. He was, it turned out, good at it. Some ghosts never leave the battlefield.